What's up, everyone? Welcome to another Card Advantage video. I'm Jacob, and today we have Cody and Chad. Cody's on our top right, and Chad's on our bottom right. And they haven't been on the channel in a while, but I'm super excited to have them on here for the card rulings video for Dynasty. Hopefully, you guys have gone back and watched our Uprising ones and our Everfest ones. Those are really cool videos. I'm happy that we're making another one for the new set Dynasty. So definitely stay tuned, and also look at the chapters below. If there's specific card rulings you're interested in seeing, we're going to have all of those down there. And like and subscribe if you're not. It would really support us, and we would be super appreciative of it. So we're just going to go ahead and hop in. It's going to be some of these are going to just be going quickly through them, and some of them are more intense rulings. So we'll just hop into it. For the first one, we're going to be talking about new mechanics, and piercing is one of the new mechanics that we got from Dynasty. Piercing says if this is defended by an equipment and has +1 damage. The thing to keep an eye out for piercing is that if it's defended by multiple equipments, it only gets one instance of the +1 damage. There is piercing 2 and 3 on some warrior cards, which is a good thing to look out for. But like, for example, on a warrior card with piercing 3, if the opponent blocks with 2 different equipments, it will only get +3 damage.
Absolutely. Another keyword or mechanic is Ephemeral, and we got this on the card Crouching Tiger. It's actually the only one in the set that has Ephemeral, so possibly more to come. But Crouching Tiger reads that it says, if Crouching Tiger would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, instead it just ceases to exist. Some things to note about Crouching Tigers specifically are they are cards still, they're not tokens, and they do not need to be registered in your deck, even though you might be creating them in your list. But however, you can still include up to 3 copies of a Crouching Tiger in your deck because they are still cards.
Yep, the next one is Overpower. So in this case, the defending hero can't defend with more than 1 action card. Fairly straightforward, but it's worth pointing out that is action card, so non-attack actions, attack actions. This does not include reactions or instants.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I just realized if you play Art of War and you select Defend from Arsenal, and your Arsenal is an action card and you already defended from hand with an action card, you can't get around it like you could with a different keyword like Dominate would be. The next one is another one where there's only one card with this keyword, which is Construct. And we have Construct Nitro Mechanoid, the new Mechanologist card that lets you summon the actual Nitro Mechanoid. And I'll just go through how Construct works first. You have to transform a bunch of stuff, equipment and hyperdrivers, into the Construct Nitro Mechanoid, and the instructions are on the card. You put them under the Nitro Mechanoid, and if you aren't able to put all of those under it, like if you only had 2 hyperdrivers instead of 3, this card would fizzle. It would just go to your graveyard, but none of your stuff would get destroyed. It would all stay existing. And then Nitro Mechanoid itself will have those cards under it, so you must banish the card from under it to attack with it. And if you have no cards under it, you can't attempt to banish a card, so you can't even attack with it at all after there's no cards under it.
However, you can still defend with it even though the cards are not underneath it. So the block mechanic still works, just not the attack mechanic.
Yep.
And if you want to see it be constructed, go watch our last stream.
Yeah, go check out some of our streams. We've been playing with Dash for a couple weeks now, for sure.
Absolutely. The next thing that we got is actually a returning mechanic called Ward. So we've seen Ward before in other sets. And actually, Spectral Shield, interesting to note, it actually got errated to have Ward. But something interesting to note about Ward itself is that in this set, there's multiple ways where you can get multiple instances of Ward to stack. And the owner of those replacement effects, they get to choose how they resolve. And so where this could come into play would be a card such as Wave of Reality and Spectral Shield or Tome of Ao. For instance, so you had Tome of Ao, and you have the equipment arm piece, Illusionist arm piece, Wave of Reality, which has Ward 1 as well, and you get attacked for 1 damage. You, as the controlling player of those replacement effects, get to choose which ward gets put first. And so if you wanted your Tome of Ao to get destroyed instead of your Wave of Reality, you could choose that, or vice versa.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to note with Ward is, although this interaction didn't come with Dynasty, it is a recent update to the release notes with the card Sand Cover, which applies Ward to other objects, the sands. You used to be able to, I believe, apply 2 instances of Ward to the same object. You can still do that, but only one of those preventions will happen. So that's an update
Correct.
to the release notes to keep in mind that I just wanted to talk about during this section because it's relevant to Ward. Yeah, so the next mechanic we're going to be talking about is another new one, which is Contract. It is unique to Assassin, the new class we got in Dynasty, and contracts interact a little bit interestingly with each other, where a contract is live for as long as it's face up in the arena, which it says in the reminder text. But that does mean that if you have a 2-contract combat chain and the second one hits and fulfills the first one's contract, you still get the silver. So that is a big strength and why some people are trying to build maybe go again assassins. And then additionally, something to keep in mind with contract is it says whenever you are contracted to banish opponents' attack action cards, so that means you have to be the one banishing it or owning the effect that banishes it. This comes up specifically when your opponent's playing Art of War, for example. Art of War says banish an attack action card, but your opponent is the one doing that. So even if you have Annihilate the Armed on the combat chain, if your opponent plays an Art of War and banishes an attack action card, you do not get a silver for that.
Yep, so next we've got the Dust cycle. There are 3 currently. So Dust from the Golden Plains as an example. Again, in this case, it's worth noting the card does not have Go Again. So when you play this, that is your action point for the turn. There is the interesting upgrade that it gives to Dromai in that if you're going first, you can play this turn 0. But the other thing to point out is that means on your follow-up turn, you can make a dragon, but even if it's a 1-cost dragon and it's the usual quote-unquote Ash neutral, it really matters which Ash is in play to start, because if this is the only one to start and you're pitching a red, this is the target no matter which dragon you're putting down. You can't save it and use the one from the pitch.
So another one we have is Skullcrack. It's also referring to when you get the randomly discarded effect of gaining the resource. So it's interesting to note that you can actually gain the resource off of other ways of discarding Skullcrack if it's random. The only one that we can refer to right now is Crippling Crush. Would be the only mechanic that would actually do that to gain you the resource. Probably wouldn't benefit you too much, but it won't benefit. If you get pummeled or you have another discard effect such as Terrace Under, Trade In, Cornet Peak, Winter's Bite, all of those discard triggered effects, and you try to discard Skullcrack, you won't gain that additional resource. And likely for the other cards, Berserk and Reincarnate also have randomly discarded effects that can trigger. Again, if it's not random, you don't gain the benefit or the triggered effect off that card.
Yeah, and you can't just tell your opponent, I'm going to get pummeled, but then randomly decide using a dice which card I'm going to discard. That will not count as random.
No ways to cheat the system.
Yep. Rock. So with Season Saviour, we have a interesting new equipment which starts with -1 counters with Battle Worn. There's a new it says when you equip Season Saviour, and equipping does happen at the beginning of the game. There's one other hero in the game called Taylor, which is a promo hero that you could get from participating and winning a cosplay contest a couple times. And that hero also has the keyword equip when you can equip items from your sideboard. But with just normal game actions, you do count as equipping equipment at the beginning of the game. So it's just like with Dash's items, like with Teklo Core, when it enters the arena, you put 2 counters on it. Even though it's before the game, technically, like before you've drawn up, you still put the counters on it. So the same thing applies for Season Saviour. You have to start with those 2 -1 counters on it. I don't think that was necessarily in question, but it's just interesting to note that this equip keyword keeps coming up, and it does, like, you are technically equipping equipment at the beginning of the game. But yeah, there are interesting rulings when it comes to Rock. I think everyone's already figured it out by now. If you have no cards in hand, you can't activate Rock. If your last card in hand is a blue, you can't say I'm pitching a blue and then I have no cards in hand and I'm using it to activate Rock. You actually have to go around and find ways to circumvent the 3 pitch requirement, which makes it very difficult to build this, but also rewarding because obviously 1 card for 7 damage is a very high rate. So I think the head judge, Joshua Scott, actually posted a whole table of all the different ways you could float resources and get discounts on the Rock activation to find ways to cast it. But it's just useful to note in this video that it's a ruling video. If you're new to Flesh and Blood, you can't just pitch just because you want to. You must have an action to declare first, and then you have to pitch for it. And you cannot declare Rock as an action if you have any cards in hand.
Yeah, the most common way to activate Rock is going to be having a one cost go again card where you pitch a blue and you have no more other cards in hand. You have 2 floating resources, and then you activate Tunic to gain the 3rd resource to then swing the rock.
Yeah, and then the damage prevention note on it is very interesting. You can go back and watch our Everfest release notes when we talk about the damage prevention effect from Swarming Gloomveil interacting with a Spectral Shield or a stack of Spectral Shields. Anything that says damage can't be prevented is talking specifically about things that say prevent X damage. So if you have 3 Spectral Shields, all 3 of those shields will break and try to prevent the damage from rock, but they will fail and you will take 7 damage. But the Spectral Shields will still get destroyed and not prevent it. It doesn't mean you can't block. You can block as normal. It's just the key word. If a card says prevent damage, it cannot be prevented. Or rock's damage cannot be prevented.
All right, next we have Tiger Swipe. Basically, this card says block me no matter what. But to go into a little more detail, it's a card that has combo, and it's basically rewarding you for the thing that you already want to be doing as that hero. So you're going to be playing a number of Crouching Tigers in a turn that you want to play Tiger Swipe. Again, the only Crouching Tigers that actually work for this effect are ones that are on the combat chain. They do not count if they're in your hand or if they're in Banish Zone and you're still able to play them. You have to actually have played them for them to have the effect. But in this case, you're going to be attacking with the Crouching Tigers, playing the Tiger Swipe at the end of that, and looking to basically re-up the effect that you already got, which heavily incentivizes the opponent to block this out if at all possible. Honestly, to me, it actually reminds me a lot of an older card called Arknight Ascendancy. And in that case, it's doing the same thing based off of Rune Chance as Viserai or any Runeblade. Viserai specifically in this case, because it's the specialization. You're going to have the Rune Chance to start your turn. You're going to attack with this, which will send them. And then this basically gives you the rebate back on any damage that spills through from this card back into Rune Chance. So it kind of feels like a very similar type effect, but in this case for Ninja. And again, just to bring it back to the beginning, I think ultimately this card says block it out no matter what.
Yeah, and I do want to note, it says it on the card that the Tigers you create, you may play them this turn. There are no Tiger cards that let you bank Tigers for other turns. So once a Tiger hits that Banish Zone, you might want to keep track of the ones that you put there this turn as opposed to last turn, because the Ephemeral keyword doesn't destroy Tigers in Banish Zone. So you actually will end up leaving the Tigers you created. If like your opponent were to play an Arclight Sentinel, for example, and you made 7 Tigers, they will stay in the Banish Zone, but you will never be able to play them again. So just if anyone's playing this, try to keep track of the ones you created this turn that you may play this turn, so that you don't confuse them with ones that may be stuck there that you cannot play.
Yeah, another scenario where that could come up is something like Red in the Ledger or Immobilizing Shot, where the one that you play makes them, but you're prevented from being able to do more on the turn.
Absolutely. Yep, I think this card plays obviously better in Katsu. It's something to note is that it has combo, so it works with things like Breaking Scales, and also combos with Katsu's ability of being able to fetch a combo card.
Yeah, so the next one is Spirit of Eirina. There are a few interesting things around this card. The first one is obvious, like the most obvious, and the strength of this one is if you play a Lumina Ascension at instant speed, because this exists, you get Go again. I don't know if Warriors had access to that effect before, but if you're a Runeblade player, it acts the same as if you Spellbound Creepers an action card with Go again in at instant speed. So it's just something to note. And then the next more interesting aspect of this is, firstly, if Spirit of Eirina would be put into your soul instead put it into the arena, that is a replacement effect. So the act of charging this in, and it going into the arena is not a trigger that gets created on the stack. It just basically happens. So charging as an additional cost will put it into your soul. It will attempt to go into a soul and instead be put into the arena. If your opponent wanted to respond to that, they would not be able to. They'd have to wait for you to take another game action with your priority before they can respond at instant speed. So the next thing to note is there are 2 different interactions, or I should say 3 interactions to keep track of with this card. The first one is it still counts as charging for the additional cost of charge. As well as with Halo of Illumination, it says put a card into Soul and then draw a card. Even though this didn't end up in the Soul, it still counts as you taking that action, and you still get to draw a card. But there's another interesting part of the release notes, which it calls out Vestige of Soul, which says if the only thing you did on your turn as far as like putting things in Soul or attempting to do it was charge the Spirit of Eirina, and it goes onto the battlefield, your Vestige of Soul effect is actually not active. The Vestige of Soul says if you've put a card into your Soul this turn, every time you pitch a light card, get one more resource. That one will not actually be active if the only card you put in Soul or attempted to put in Soul this turn was Spirit of Eirina. So that's 3 different things to keep in mind. The release notes, if you want to go into it and read specifically why that works, you can do that. But those are 3 different things to keep track of with regards to the charge requirements and putting things in Soul and whether it will resolve or not, basically.
Next interesting interaction or card to mention is Jubeel Spellbane. It is a warrior weapon sword. It's a 1-for-3 attack. And it says basically, if on hit, you do not control a spellbound Aegis, when the sword hits, then you create one. Basically, is a token that has Spell Void 1 and no other effects on it. But the things to note about when this happens and when this hits is if you control a spellbound Aegis, you do not create another one. So if you have one in play already and this hits again, you just maintain at 1 and 1 is not created. However, in a match where you'd probably bring this in would be against wizards such as Icelander or Kano. And if you are attacking with Jubeel, and you, before damage is actually dealt, your spellbound Aegis that you might already control is destroyed by an arcane effect before damage is dealt. Then once you go to damage calculation, you'll no longer control a spellbound Aegis, and then one will be created upon hit if it does hit.
Yeah, the next one is Quicksilver Dagger. Again, worth noting, this one is a one-handed weapon, so it wants to be paired with another, be it another copy of Quicksilver Dagger or another one-handed warrior weapon. But the dream of making it easy does not work, so you cannot pair this with a weapon that already has Go Again. The effect of Quicksilver Dagger is that it must gain Go Again. So unfortunately, you're going to need to use cards and effects during your turn in order to generate the value off of the rules text on this card.
Yeah, and we talked about the act of gaining Go Again on Hypothermia in our Uprising release notes video. Gaining Go Again just means you went from the state of not having Go Again on your base card to the state of having Go Again. Some of the older cards are not formatted in a way that says this card gains Go Again, but it might say this card has Go Again as long as a certain condition is met. Mm-hmm. Basically, if at any point in time on the turn that card didn't have Go Again and then the condition got met and then it has Go Again, that also counts as gaining Go Again for the purposes of Quicksilver Dagger.
Yeah, I think most commonly you'll probably see this paired with either, like Chad mentioned, another Quicksilver Dagger or possibly a Centauri Saber. And you'll see someone swing the Saber, wait for reactions, play a Blade Runner, which gives the target sword Go Again. And then in that case, that sword has gained Go Again, in which case it would give Go Again to Quicksilver Dagger.
And then all of a sudden the warrior's half imitating Katsu.
Oh, yes.
Yep, so the next one we're going to talk about is Ironsong Pride. And I just wanted to bring up the fact that this happens at instant speed, unlike a lot of warrior stuff that's an attack reaction. First thing to note is there is not any possible way to pass the reaction step and put the +1 counter on before damage calculation. That's literally an instant like window where as soon as both players pass attack and defense reactions on an empty stack, it moves directly into damage calc, and the damage calc happens first. So if you're attacking for 3 and your opponent's blocking for 3, there's no way to put a +1 counter on it with this card and not have your opponent have a chance to like de-react it, like use Oldham's Earth React or something. Alternatively, if you have attacked for 3 and your opponent let it hit, and you think for some reason maybe they have a sink below an arsenal or a de-react, you can let damage calculation happen. If you have any on hits, they happen. And then at instant speed, you can cast Ironsong Pride, put the +1 counter on it. The +1 will not apply to your damage calculation, but for Ironsong Pride's restriction, which is at the beginning of your end phase, if a sword does not hit this turn, destroy it, and when it leaves the arena, remove all +1 counters. This will still count as your card hitting, even though you played it after the card hitting or after the sword hit. So keep in mind, you can't buff it at instant speed without your opponent having a D-react, but you can sneak the +1 counter on it for like next turn and still commit the condition of having hit this turn, even though you played it later. I don't know if that scenario will come up very often, but it is interesting to note that it will kind of see back in time that it did hit this turn.
The next card we're talking about is Hanabi Blaster, which is a Mechanologist gun. It's interesting to note with this one specifically is it says when you have played 3 cards that have boost, you put a counter on it. There's no limit to the number of counters you can actually stack on the weapon, so it can have an infinite number of counters. However, it's also interesting to note that you do not have to boost 3 attacks with dash to put the counter on there. You just simply have to have played 3 cards with boost, with the keyword boost on it. So you can boost the first 2 attacks and then just play down the third boost attack, not boosting, and you can still get your counter on it. Also, something interesting to note about this weapon here is that it is not a pistol. It is specifically the weapon type gun. So you cannot partner this with Induction Chamber if you're dash to give it go again, because it's not a pistol.
This kind of ties it straight into Powder Keg as well, which also references the Mechanologist gun. So again, just to call it out in this case, the Tecloplasma pistol is not something that pairs with this because pistol is not a gun, it's a pistol. But the effect of Powder Keg is such that any defending equipment on the chain is the clause. So if a previous attack has equipment that defended on it, and then a later attack with the weapon that is specifically a Mechanologist gun triggers this, you can destroy the equipment that is blocking the previous attacks. It's a little unfortunate that you can't really pull this off as a surprise play of any kind. Like, ideally with this effect, you'd be thinking that you want to engineer a scenario to get them to block with equipment and then gotcha with this card, but it's sitting there on the table. It requires the opponent to forget about it in order to really get them that way.
Yeah. The last thing to note on this is it's a single trigger that has multiple effects. A lot of Fab cards aren't like this. The most obvious other one that I can think of is Sonata Arconyx. The card choice and the card going to hand happens simultaneously with the arcane damage being dealt, and that's the same with the Powder Keg effect. So basically, the trigger will still go on the stack, which says you hit with the Mechanologist gun, but you don't have to target an equipment when the trigger goes on the stack, and your opponent doesn't know if you're going to actually resolve that when it goes on the stack. When you go to resolving the trigger, all 3 things happen simultaneously. You destroy the Powder Keg, or it's not 3 things, it's 2 things. You destroy the Powder Keg, and you destroy a defending equipment. So the reason this might come up is like, if for some reason, this would probably never happen, but if your opponent blocked with a Tunic on an early chain link and it has 3 counters on it, and then later on you hit with a Mechanologist gun and the Powder Keg trigger goes on the stack, if your opponent doesn't respond by removing their Tunic counter, and because they think for some reason this is not going to happen, but they think you're not going to trigger the Powder Keg, once you go into resolving the Powder Keg, you're like, I'm destroying the Tunic and my Powder Keg. Your opponent doesn't get to remove the Tunic counter because they will not have priority at that point in time. So I don't know if there's like other interactions. That's the only one I could think of for now, and it's probably never going to happen. But it's just good to note that this is all on the same line of text, and it all happens at the same time at resolution of this trigger. So do keep that in mind. Your opponent can't respond in between them, but they can respond before it goes on the stack. Oh, it's similar to like Katsu's ability. The first time you hit with an attack action card, yep, Katsu's ability will go on the stack, but your opponent can respond to it, but they don't know if you're going to actually choose to resolve it, basically.
Other things that happen just like that are Metacarpus nodes, or Metacarpus node, I should say. It goes on the stack as a trigger first for your opponent to respond to before you resolve it. Same thing with Refraction Bolters. Yeah. It goes on the stack as a triggered ability for your opponent to respond before you choose to resolve it. But once you resolve it, your opponent cannot respond.
Yeah, so the next one that comes up in Dash's section is the Pulsewave Harpoon. The first thing to note is it counts its own boost, just like all of the Everfest cards that count how many times you've boosted or if you've boosted. When you determine X, if you boosted once before Pulsewave Harpoon, and then you boost Pulsewave Harpoon as well, since boosting is an additional cost, the Pulsewave Harpoon will see both boosts, and X will be 2. So the next thing to note is if somehow you become X equals 4, your opponent reveals their whole 4 cards from hand. If they have a card in hand which does not block, like a Gorganian Tome, for example, you cannot add it to the defending chain. However, if they have a banned card like Ball Lightning, which has 0 defense, you can add that to the chain. The next thing to note is adding the card to the chain. It will become defending, and the opponent will be blocking with it. And if it's the blocking 3, then your attack will deal 3 less damage. But it does not count as the act of defending with that card. The reason this matters is for cards like Findell's Fighting Spirit. If your opponent has less life than you, and you choose Findell's Fighting Spirit to be the card that Pulsewave Harpoons pulls onto the combat chain, the opponent will not gain life off of Findell's Fighting Spirit. Specifically, the release notes does call this out. It does not trigger when you defend or when this defends effects. So Findell's Fighting Spirit is like the most popular one that's been used recently, but Brothers in Arms is another one. If you choose Brothers in Arms to go onto the stack or go onto the defending chain link, your opponent doesn't get the opportunity to pay 1 to buff its defense. So that's one interaction that I wouldn't actually have figured out from reading this card by default. A lot of these interactions are just us explaining specifically how to read the card, but I didn't see that one coming, and I thought it was really interesting when I read it in the release notes.
Yeah, whenever I reviewed the notes that we did before the video here, and I read over that one, that was actually the one that caught my biggest attention, was like, wow, I would not have figured that out, just like Jacob said. Another one would be Pack Call, would be another triggered when defending type of event that this would not allow to trigger. Another thing to note is that, just like Jacob said, if your opponent reveals a hand and has Ball Lightning in it, before you choose Ball Lightning as a card to defend with, because you can, call a Judge on your opponent.
That's a good point.
All right, next we have Crankshaft. This one, it's here mostly just to call out some interaction with Hyperdriver. So there's a little bit of a wording difference here. So Hyperdriver says when you boost a card, remove a Steam counter from it. And Crankshaft says when it's banished to pay a boost cost. So wording's a little different, but those two things happen in the same moment in game terms. So you have the choice how to order those effects. Again, very important if you're playing higher level tournaments that you take the actions in the correct order if you're wanting to save a hyperdriver that has a single resource on it, because you first need to resolve the crankshaft effect to put a counter on, bring it up to 2, and then 1 comes off and you're able to save it. If you actually take the actions in the other order, you cannot save the hyperdriver. It goes to 0, it gets destroyed immediately from its own effect, and then you'll resolve crankshaft.
Yeah. Urgent Delivery is just a really quick one. This one allows you to, when it hits, put a mech item into the arena from your hand for the number of times you've boosted. This card doesn't have boost, so obviously if it's the only one you played, you have boosted 0 times. But Teklo-Core is an example of a mech item with cost 0. So if this hits and you've boosted 0 times, you still can put a Teklo-Core into the arena. So that's just something interesting to note. Everything else is like just normally counting how many times you've boosted and on hit effects. But I did want to note that 0 cost items can be entered from hitting this, even if you've not boosted at all, which makes this actually a pretty strong card.
Absolutely. Next one is an assassin weapon, Spider's Bite, which is the only assassin weapon that we have right now. The Spider's Bite says that when this hits, or if this hits, the next time an opponent defends with an attack action card, it receives -1 defense. And interesting to note, when you swing 2 Spider Bites in one turn, these effects can stack. So if the first one hits, then the second Spider Bite hits, their next cards, 1 or more cards that they defend with, attack action cards, will receive -2 defense in that scenario. So if you have something like a turn where Spider Bite, and then CNC, their attack action cards will only defend for 1 or 0, depending on if they defend for 3 or 2 naturally. I thought that was a pretty interesting effect that the can stack. Something else to note on the wording, the specific choice of words on Spider Bite, it's the next time they defend with an attack action card. So if you swing the first Spider Bite and it hits, and then you swing the second Spider Bite and they defend with an attack action card that gets -1 defense and defends for 1 or 2 and stops the Spider Bite from hitting, then the card after that they defend with won't have the first -1 defense from the first Spider Bite hitting.
Yeah. Yeah, and then just to go further into that scenario, if they go 2 Spider Bites, you block the second one with an attack, and then they Razor Reflex that Spider Bite, it will count as that one hitting, and so that it will have 1 instance of the Spider Bite effect, because your first attack action card will eat up the first Spider Bite's on hit effect, but the second Spider Bite will have hit, and then if you need to defend with an attack action card another time in the turn, it will have 1 instance of -1 defense.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it goes pretty far with that. Double Spider's Bite into CNC is like insanely strong and annoying.
Oh yeah.
All right, next we have Regicide. This one's mostly here just as a PSA. You do not lose the game if you defend with this card. The rules text of a card only applies when it's actually being played. When you defend with a card, it is not played unless it's a defense reaction.
Yeah, unless otherwise specific. Otherwise
Yeah,
specified.
unless otherwise specified.
Yeah. There are some cards that, like we said earlier with the dash card, like we said earlier with Pulsewave Harpoon, some cards do say when you defend with this, but Regicide very clearly does not say when you defend with this. So don't worry about blocking with Regicide. It's a pretty free card to include in your deck as a 3-block. So yeah, just remember.
All right, and the next one we have up is Sandscour Greatbow. This is a very interesting card, as you've probably seen on the channel already. A lot of time and effort's gone into analysis on this. But so the effect of this card is multi-level depending on the game state. You can have a completely full arsenal and still activate the bow. That's a scenario where you're using it mostly as a way of pay 1 resource to gain information. Again, very common scenario. Azalea, arrow on top. Now I get free dominate. So if you have the ability to activate even if your arsenal is full, it can be worth it for that knowledge. And then the other major effect of this card is centered around aim counters. It's worth noting that it's not tied to the activation of the bow. It's a static effect on the bow. So any effect that makes a card go from your deck into your arsenal face up will generate an aim counter on that card. It is possible to get multiple aim counters on a card, something like Azalea in an arrow, and then play Push the Point, if that's the right name of the new card.
I think it's Point the Tips.
Or Point the Tip, yeah. The +3 that gives the additional aim counter. So it is technically possible to get 2 on there. At the moment, there is no card that has any rules text that is dependent on multiple. So there is no added value in doing that. It's just technically possible right now. The only things that care about aim counters are cards that have the rules text if this has an aim counter on it. A lot of the new arrows in Dynasty as the primary case at the moment.
Yeah, I just wanted to note one more thing with the common theme of like having multiple effects resolving at the same time. If you had a sigil in Arsenal, and then you look at the top of your deck and it's an arrow, you cannot put that card. You cannot play the sigil at instant speed and then put that arrow from the top into your arsenal. Unless your sigil was face up and you're running New Horizon for some reason. All of these things happen at the same time. So make sure you're resolving all of it as one thing with no priority in between it.
Sticking on the Ranger theme, we have Heat Seeker next. So this is a majestic arrow for Ranger. It's a 1-for-5 attack. But the interesting thing to note on it is it has a triggered ability if it hits. It says at the beginning of your in phase, you put the top card of your deck face up into an arsenal zone you control. So if you're running something like New Horizon with one of the Rangers, and you have no cards in your arsenal when this hits, then you are actually forced. It's not a may effect, it's a forced effect that you put the top card of your deck face up into arsenal, and that happens first at the beginning of your end phase, before the end of your turn, which is when you have a chance to arsenal a card. So Heatseeker is a very strong way to either end a chain or dominate an arrow with Azalea to make sure you can possibly set up a double arsenal if you're playing something like New Horizon.
All right, next we have Diabolic Ultimatum, but this is here mostly as a stand-in for a lot of the new Runeblade cards. What we want to call out here is the typical effect of if an attack action card was pitched, or a non-attack action card, or in some cases both, have different effects on the card. In all of these cases, it works just like Old Hymn from Tales, where it looks at the actual cards pitched for the cost, not just cards that are in your pitch zone. So anything pitched prior in the turn has absolutely no relation to the effects of this card when you play it.
So the next part of the Runeblade section is Looming Doom. Right at the beginning of this, I just want to give a shout out to Ethnic Smoke. He has a video going through this entire interaction, so check out his video. We'll link it. You can go see the strength of it and some of the combos he's put together with it. But just as a quick rundown of what's happening here, when this enters the arena, you destroy all the rune chants you control, and then put a number of Doom counters equal to that. And then at the beginning of your end phase, remove one Doom counter and deal 2 arcane damage to any target. So a couple things to note are, if you somehow play this at instant speed and rune chants are on the stack, then those will still deal arcane damage, and they will also count towards Looming Doom, and they will get destroyed, but their triggers will stay and deal arcane damage. Additionally, the 2 arcane damage that happens at the beginning of your end phase can be ordered however you want with other beginning of end phase triggers, for example, Spellbound Creepers, which is very important because if you have not dealt arcane damage this turn, and you want to keep your Spellbound Creepers around, like it has 2 counters on it, you can layer the Looming Doom effect over top of the Spellbound Creepers, and if the opponent doesn't block it, then Spellbound Creepers condition will be fulfilled and it will stay around. So those are 2 quick things to go over with this card. Definitely check out Ethnic Smoke's video on it. He goes a lot more in depth into how that interaction works, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, heavily recommend.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that Runeblades get to split their split damage at this point.
Yeah,
Because
they
they're
just
normally split between arcane and regular on the same turn, and now you get to split the arcane between multiple turns.
yeah, it's actually pretty nuts.
Moving into Wizards, the new mechanic here that we got in Dynasty is Surge. So it's an effect that has on many Wizard cards in the set. It's important to note what Surge is. Essentially, all Surge effects say basically if it deals more arcane, typically than the base damage of arcane dealt on the card, then the Surge will trigger. So it's usually +1 on whatever it's typically dealing. So usually having to buff it with something like Crucible of Aetherweave. It's also worth mentioning that it's counting damage dealt after any kind of prevention effects. So if you're having to work through Spectral Shields or work through Oasis Respites, the Surge doesn't trigger, or actually I shouldn't say trigger, the Surge does not happen if the damage is prevented. Even though it's being dealt, it has to be dealt to the hero for the Surge to happen. The reason I said not triggered is because we're specifically calling out that Surge is not a triggered effect. So whenever the arcane damage is dealt, that Surge effect just happens. There's no trigger to respond to. No one can say, hey, I will respond to the Surge effect. It just happens immediately.
All right, another one to call out a few edge cases is Mind Warp. In this case, there are a couple of scenarios where it's worth knowing how this card works. So if the opponent has no cards in their hand, they still shuffle their deck if the Surge is triggered. Additionally, there's an even rarer, I would expect, edge case that if they have no cards in their library and in their deck and have cards in hand only, they still shuffle those as their deck and draw the same hand -1 card. So you're effectively, in that very edge case scenario, able to get them to not have one of the cards in their hand.
Yeah, both of those scenarios are very weird and probably won't come up very often. Well, the no cards in hand one probably would come up because that's the only reason your opponent would ever let the Mind Warp hit for
Yeah.
more than 2 arcane damage. So keep that one in mind. But both of them are very interesting for sure. Yeah, Sap is another quick one. A lot of effects that do not say don't say target are chosen on resolution. So it's just another quick reminder: when the Surge effect for Sap happens, when it resolves, you remove an energy counter from a permanent. This is another instance where if your opponent has 3 energy counters on their tunic and they let you hit sap for 4 damage, they do not get an opportunity after that 4 damage happens to remove their tunic counter before you remove an energy counter from the tunic.
Moving into illusionist or more illusionist cards. First one we have for you is Spectral Procession. This is the card that evaluates it's a star attack. So it's a 0-cost star attack, defends for 3. The star is related to the number of shields that you control. And this is constantly being evaluated as the game state progresses. So if your opponent's able to destroy some of your spectral shields before damage calculation, then the attack value of Spectral Procession changes along with the number of shields you have remaining.
Yeah, I think that's the same way the effect works for like Mutated Mass from Monarch as well.
Same thing with Anathos as well.
Yep. Old faithful Anathos. Yeah, so I wanted to actually contrast that with Spectral Prowler, which has a condition dependent on spectral shields. But this one has more specific restrictions on it. This one says when you play it, if you control a spectral shield, it gains go again. So there are 2 different things to note with this. The condition of controlling it is evaluated after it's played before it becomes attacking. So basically, if you put Spectral Prowler onto the stack, you can respond, like if you're playing Prism and Blitz, you can respond by making a Spectral Shield before the Spectral Prowler resolves. And then when the Spectral Prowler resolves, it will see that Spectral Shield and it will gain go again. Alternatively, if you let the Spectral Prowler resolve, and then like maybe during the attack reaction step, you make a Spectral Shield, it doesn't gain go again. And then the third option is just like if you're playing against a Kano, you don't have any Spectral Shields, and then you play Spectral Prowler and respond by making a Spectral Shield, the Kano can say, okay, I let the Spectral Shield resolve, and then before Spectral Prowler resolves, I'm going to deal arcane damage to you. If you can't block the arcane damage and the Spectral Shield gets destroyed, then again, Spectral Prowler will not gain go again. So just keep in mind when exactly the Spectral Prowler is evaluating for the Spectral Shield, it is not constant as opposed to the Spectral Procession.
Next we have Crown of Dominion. This one is kind of a callback to some of the things we said earlier around how equip works. So main thing here is you are not royal when you're building your deck. You become royal when this is equipped at the very beginning of the game. So that means that you cannot have cards that are royal in your deck just by playing Crown of Dominion. Your hero actually has to have royal in order to play royal. You also only have the effect while this is equipped. So if it is ever not equipped or it's destroyed, then you are no longer royal.
Yeah, so this comes up against assassins who are slotting in regicides in their deck. Obviously, if you destroy your Crown of Dominion for some other reason or another, then that card is no longer effectively able to just auto control, lose the game or win the game. The last cards that we wanted to call out and last things that we wanted to mention for Dynasty was ways in which temper equipment can be destroyed, because there's a number of them. We'll cover what temper does. So temper is unlike Blade Break or unlike Battle Worn in the sense that when the defending equipment has 0 defense and the combat chain closes, that piece of equipment is then destroyed. So some interesting ways that you can destroy tempered equipment in the set are Drill Shot, Scramble Pulse, and Shred. So Drill Shot is the Ranger arrow that says when it hits, you put a -1 counter on a piece of equipment that they control. So if let's say the defending equipment, the non-defending equipment was Crater Fist, and it's in the zone, it wasn't used to defend that turn, and you still put the -1 counter, in that sense, temper would not trigger because it was not a defending piece of equipment. So the Crater Fist would just have -2 counters on it. So unlike Drill Shot, for Mechanologists that have Scramble Pulse, that says that the defending equipment receive -1 counter while defending this combat chain. So Scramble Pulse will put the -1 counter or -1 defense on the equipment. And then because that equipment was used to defend that combat chain, temper will trigger when the combat chain closes, receiving 1 more -1 counter on the piece of equipment. And in the case of Crater Fist, its defense value would then be equal to 0, and then would be destroyed when the combat chain closes, because Scramble Pulse gave it -1, and then temper triggers and gives another -1 to be 0. For assassins, they have a really cool way of just like basically instantly blowing up tempered equipment with shred. So shred comes in all colors and says that you target card receives -4, 3, or 2 defense depending upon what color shred it is. And so any tempered equipment in the game on a red shred is going to get blown up because when temper triggers, it's going to see that the defense value of that piece of equipment is 0, and it's going to be effectively destroyed when the combat chain closes because shred gave it -4, -3, or -2 value. Even something to call out is the Mechanoid. So it has 5 defense value on it, and if you defend it with Mechanoid and you got red shredded, it's going to see -4 defense. Then Temper's going to trigger, give it a -1, and it's going to destroy at the end of the combat chain. So even your mech strong pieces of assembling the whole mech verse is going to be destroyed with a red shred. So Assassin's got some pretty strong cards at set.
Yeah. So that's about it for all the card rulings. This one ended up being a lot longer than the Dynasty or than the Uprising and the Everfest card rulings videos, but there was a lot of stuff to cover. Some returning mechanics, some new interactions, and some stuff that's just not immediately obvious. Like that Pulsewave Harpoon one, I did not see that one coming, but I'm glad that I know about it now, so that there's not going to be some long judge call during an event going forward. But if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely leave a like. Comment down below if you think there's a ruling we missed. Also comment if we were wrong about something. I will admit it's definitely possible for me to be wrong. Additionally, if there's an errata in the future, we will try to update comments below saying if there's an incorrect ruling that was correct at this time but changes in the future. And then as always, if you're not subscribed, we would greatly appreciate it if you subscribed and supported us like that. It would be awesome. And keep an eye out for future videos. We'll definitely be releasing more over time, as well as streaming on Tuesdays at 7:30. Me and Steven most of the time, but sometimes other team members hop on. Thanks again, Cody and Chad, for joining for this one. I'm glad you guys got to show up with us, and we'll see everyone next time.